You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
This episode of Rootbound is brought to you by the family Solanaceae. If you like tomatoes, then we're your family. Potatoes? That's us. Eggplant? Look no further. Deadly poison? We know a guy. The family Solanaceae. We are edible. Sometimes.
Hi everybody, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I am the host of the show, and my name is Steve. Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with the guest about a plant that means something to me. And through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of this show that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. Now, before we start the show, I want to explain to you a little bit of where I am standing. Let's take a little quick listen here. Hear some wind, some birds, a riding lawnmower in the distance. I was hoping for it to be a little bit more peaceful when I decided to record this, but you can't control when people decide to mow their lawns. But later in this episode, we're going to speak with our guest about being in your favorite places in nature. And so I thought I would record this intro from one of my favorite places in nature. There's a lot of them, and the reason this is my favorite place is because I'm standing in a small grove of sassafras trees. And through this podcast and the last several years, sassafras has come to be one of my favorite plants. And this plant has taught me many things, and that's something else our guest is going to talk about, is a plant teaching you things and bringing you on a journey. And I think sassafras is one of the many plants, and probably one of the top plants that has done that for me. I've learned so much from sassafras. I've learned a lot about plant identification. I've learned a lot about plant biology. I've learned a lot about sustainable use of plants and different kinds of both food and medicinal use of plants from sassafras. And sassafras has also taught me lots of lessons about history, both, history broadly, but also personal history and connections to plants that my family has had through time. And so this little patch of sassafras is not in a very remote place. As you can hear the lawnmower in the distance, I can see a little road just, not too far away from here. But this patch of sassafras is at my mom's place in Rappahannock, Virginia, and this is the first place that I ever harvested sassafras root for myself. And it's one of the first places that I was proud of myself for identifying sassafras in the springtime before it had fully leafed out, because there's some certain keys there, and the key, and the main key, is the smell, and scratching some of the plant and looking for that key sassafras smell. So the last maybe 3 years, I have harvested sassafras root here from some young saplings, because sassafras has this habit of growing small suckers all around it, and so I can see all the different sassafras all around me. There's lots of it, and so that was kind of the lesson in sustainable use. And I've harvested the sassafras root for tea the last 3 years, but this year I'm not going to harvest any sassafras, and that's also has to do with my learning process, because just because I'm here and just because I'm with this plant doesn't mean I need to harvest it, and I still have some sassafras root from last year. So this year we're going to give it a little break, and I'm just going to enjoy these really cool trees with their really cool multivariate leaves and their really cool smells and flavors. So let's meet our guest, and we'll learn a little bit more about how plants can take us on journeys.
Gonna take a sentimental journey, gonna set my heart at ease, gonna make a sentimental journey to renew old memories.
Hi, Tina. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. Today I have sword fern.
Cool. I'm pretty sure, I've done a lot of episodes, but I'm pretty sure this is the first fern we've talked about on the program. So congratulations for choosing the first fern. And I've heard the word sword fern. I think I know nothing else about it except for what little I know about ferns. So I'm happy to hear about it. But let's start off by why did you choose this plant? Why is it meaningful to you?
So I chose sword fern because it kind of for me represents my relationship with the land that I'm on here and the development of that relationship sort of from beginning when I didn't really know anything about the ecosystem I'm in all the way to now where I'm my work is deep connection with nature. So
Mm,
kind of represents my
interesting.
journey. Yeah.
Yeah, explain that more. Like, how do you come to identify your connection through this plant?
Okay. So sword fern, so where I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live on Bainbridge Island in Washington
Mm,
State. And it's kind of the most ubiquitous plant here in the forest. Like if you walk out, you're just going to see just a bunch of sword fern, just carpeting the undergrowth, especially if it's a healthy forest and it hasn't been, messed with a lot. Then there's going to be a lot of sword fern. And it was the first plant that I learned to identify because of how ubiquitous it is.
hmm
So I moved here from Seattle several years ago. And when I moved here, I had been living in the city for a long time. And before that, I grew up in Eastern Washington, and the ecosystem is completely different.
hmm
And so when I moved to Bainbridge Island, I was suddenly, for the first time, kind of ever, plopped into this really, really rich ecosystem surrounded by nature. And I was just here and I realized, wow, I really know nothing about the plants here, about what's happening here. And I'm just in it and I want to get to know it better. So literally it was just the first plant that I could see growing everywhere. So it was the first plant I learned to identify. And over the years of being here, every time I learned something new about sword fern, it was like almost representative of a new step in my depth of knowledge of the whole ecosystem.
Wow, that's really
Um,
cool. I def
yeah,
I'll let you lead us. I definitely want to hear about each of those steps. So let's not skip that. It's probably where you're going, but that sounds really cool.
yeah. I'd been living here for a while, and actually, part of the reason I also really wanted to learn facts about the plants here was because I had just had a baby. We were going to be raising kids. I wanted to be able to teach them about what
hmm
was around them and have them have a connection with the earth. So I remember one day we live close to the library here, and ferns are used in a lot of landscaping here too, just because they're a native plant that just thrives.
hmm
So there were all these sword ferns in the library landscaping, and one day I walked in, we were going to the children's library. I was with my kids, and I noticed that all the ferns had been completely cut back. Like they were gone. And I was like, what? What happened? What did they do? Why did they cut all the ferns down? And I didn't realize at the time that ferns really love to be pruned. And so all you
mm
could see were these like hairy lumps at the base of where the ferns were. And those were actually the new sort of fiddleheads that were going to unfold and come up. And they had pruned them
mm
all back so that part of the plant could grow and thrive. And I didn't know about that, but then I had to go learn about that because I was kind of distraught. And then as we would come to the library over the next several weeks, I was able to watch as those new growth and those fiddleheads sort of unfurled and regrew. And I realized, oh, well, obviously they did that on purpose, but
mm
but it was an interesting emotional response I had to the ferns, so I just sort of paid attention to that.
I
And then
wonder.
as I learned,
Quick question there, because I have a small child now, and she's just getting to the part where I think she's going to be able to like appreciate looking at plants. It's still a little bit early, but did your
mhm.
kids have a reaction to the ferns? What did you talk about it with them, or what is? Yeah, how did that go?
I think I just said, oh no, they cut the ferns down. But why did they cut them, mommy? I don't know. So, we were just talking about my own response because they didn't have anything to go off of. But then they were with me, because it was by the children's library where the ferns
hmm
were. So they were with me as we got to walk together and sort of discover that unfolding and talk about it. And so I do think that's been my experience. I think the best way to teach people and especially kids about plants and about nature is to be in it
hmm
and to visit the same places over and over again so you can watch how things change and talk about it and learn together. like being there with the plant and experiencing it, I think is the most powerful way to learn. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So over time, just being around in this ecosystem, I learned more things. We learned about stinging nettles, which
Mm.
grow here in the spring. And one of the remedies that people kept telling us was, oh, well, if you get stung by a stinging nettle, you can rub the back of a sword fern on your sting because there are these little spores that grow on the underside of each little thin leaf that grows on the fern. And supposedly, if you rub the spores on the nettle sting, it helps to take the
Interesting.
sting away. So uh, I have to say, it has never worked for me. I think it's just a tale. In fact, someone once told me, oh, that's something someone made up to distract kids on the trail if they get stung, because
Uh,
the nettle sting, it'll go away. It's not like getting poison ivy or poison oak
right.
or something like that. It eventually just kind of goes away, but on its own. And supposedly it's just a way to distract yourself.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know. It's a little scratchy. Maybe that kind of helps. But hasn't worked. But it's definitely that's kind of my next step in like, oh, what are the remedies in the forest? Like
Hmm.
what when one thing happens to you, there's usually something else close by that can help. And side note, actually, another thing that grows around here a lot is plantain. Not like the
Hmm.
banana plantain, but
Yeah.
just the sort of leafy green weed thing that grows.
Yeah.
And I've
Genus
actually had,
Plantago.
yes. So
Yeah.
I've actually had a lot of luck with that. You can sort of chew it up and make a poultice because it's also edible, and then put it on a nettle sting, and that actually helps a lot. So, but it was really learning this about sword fern that kind of piqued my interest in plant medicine
Mm.
and how we have remedies around us that we can tap into that most of us don't even know about. And so this is becoming kind of a long story about my
No,
journey, but I'm
I
gonna,
love it. I love it.
okay.
Keep going.
I will. Okay. So eventually just jumping forward in time, I had made the decision to train to become a nature and forest therapy guide.
Hmm.
And part of what that is basically helping connect people to the earth in a sensory body sort of heart-centered way, sort of not just learning scientific facts, but really connecting with the land and creating those relationships. And so my job is sort of to open doors for people to connect with nature that they might not have opened for themselves. So part of that practice is to find a sit spot, and that's just a place that you go outside, the same place. It could be your backyard, it could be your back porch, it could be somewhere out in the woods, just some place that's accessible to you, to sit once a week for at least 20 to 30 minutes,
Mm.
and just to keep visiting that same spot and just allow yourself to do nothing but sit and notice what's around you. So I had found a sit spot, and it was next to a pond, and there were lots of ferns around because there are lots of ferns. You can't escape the sword ferns around here. It's basically what's around you all the time if you're sitting in the woods. So I had a sit spot, and I sat for almost an entire year, coming back to that same sit spot. And throughout that time, it was like I really, really got a close up look at the entire life cycle of the ferns around me.
Mm.
And it felt really beautiful, and it felt really cool to have that connection, not just with sword fern in general, but with those particular ferns that I would come and sit next to and just watch them throughout the year as they would sort of grow up. And then, that phase that I noticed at the library where they're this sort of lumpy inner part that looks like some weird creature that's about to emerge, and then it sort of unfolds into these cool hairy fiddleheads, and then those unfold into these beautiful delicate bright green leaves, and eventually they kind of fold out and become kind of woody and hard. And it was really cool to watch the
Mm.
entire life cycle of a really particular plant out in the wild. And that was kind of, I think of as the next stage of my nature connection, is just sitting out
Hmm.
there with the plants. Yeah. And then they also have taught me a lot of things. So I am terribly arachnophobic. I can't stand spiders. and, spending a lot of time outside in the woods. And we have a lot of spiders out here.
Uh-huh.
And so and it's not even that I'm scared that they're going to like bite me. It's just
Mm,
literally the horror of seeing their legs. And so
sure.
so spending a lot of times and dedicating yourself to spend a lot of time in the woods, like creating a practice of that, it was a huge edge for me to,
Mm.
especially certain times of year, like in the fall when the spiders
Oh,
come
yeah.
to sort of have to get through it. And with the ferns, there's a certain time of year where there are these tiny little spider webs that always form sort of between the ferns, on the inside of the ferns. And they're just little, and they sort of collect all the little tiny specks of dry leaves and detritus from the forest floor. And they just sort of hover on these ferns. And especially going to my sit spot, I had to walk through all these ferns with all these little spider webs. But uh, it was kind of like exposure therapy, but it
Mhm.
was in the gentlest way because it was just at the base of the ferns and it was
Mm.
like they were just so little. But I kind of associate the ferns as sort of my support group as I had to walk through these spider webs to
Mhm.
get to my sit spot. And it really did help. Like I actually am at the point now where if I'm outside and the spiders are small, I'm okay with it. So
That's
yeah,
awesome. Wow.
I bet I felt like Fern was a little bit of my teacher there, these sword
Uh-huh.
ferns. Like, okay, we're here. You got to go through us. Don't worry, they're small. We got we got you. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. That totally makes sense. It's very different about the thing I deal with here in the spring and the fall is if you go off the trail, the spiders really like to just build their webs right at face level.
oh, that's the
and, so,
worst.
and so many times I've been like, ugh. Right. Yeah. But
Yeah.
the little cozy ones on the floor, that's seems very pleasant actually.
Yeah, it was a good starting
Mhm.
point for me. I still have to carry a big stick with me sometimes walking through the
Uh-huh.
woods in the fall because of what you just talked about.
Yeah.
It's still pretty horrible, but it's getting easier. So kind of the final stage when I think about sword burn is this trip that I took. I've actually, let's see, it was probably about 3.5 years ago now, almost 4 years ago. And I went on this wilderness survival trip.
Mm.
And it's because of this trip that I get really, really almost emotional anytime I smell the smell of a sword fern. So,
Ah.
because I got really up close and personal. So, I went with Wilderness Awareness School, which is located in Duvall, Washington, and it's a kind of a nature connection wilderness skills school, and they do this trip every once in a while called the Survival Immersion, and we you go out with kind of I think there were about 10 of us with four guides and you go out into the woods for a week and you don't bring a tent or food or a sleeping
Mm.
bag and they just teach you how to build shelter and forage for food and how to survive out there with nothing but a few layers of clothing and a knife and a poncho and that kind of thing. So
Wow.
it was pretty incredible. I was kind of terrified when I first did it, but it was just I was on this journey of like I just want to connect deeper to the land
Mhm.
here and that was a step for me. So, and I'm not going to get into all the details of that trip, but one of the things we used the most, especially in our shelter, was sword fern.
Ah.
And we used sword fern. We in order to sort of build this mattress to protect us from the ground and to insulate us, it was just a huge pile of sword fern. We had to pick so many sword fern and like the fronds, you sort of
Mhm.
layer them over top of each other. And then you can also, because of the way that the leaves grow, it's sort of one long stem with all these little leaves coming off to the side.
Mhm.
And that's not a very scientific explanation of
Sure,
it, but
sure.
it's almost like it reminds me of like little palm fronds or something.
Uh-huh.
And so, because of the way that it grows, if you kind of face them down and layer them over top of each other, you can create a roof to a shelter too that sort of sheds
Oh.
rain. And it was
Mhm.
really rainy. And you can also, I mean, you can use a lot of things in this way, but for insulation, you can kind of stuff them up your jacket between your jacket and your sweatshirt or between your
Oh.
layers of clothes, and it provides insulation, kind of like a puffer jacket. So I spent a week sleeping in sword ferns, picking the fronds, using them for shelter, stuffing them up my clothes. And it was weird, at first, but after a while, I felt so grateful. I felt
Mm.
like the forest was taking care of me and the sword ferns were sort of there and had my back. And I will never forget the smell of the sword fern. Scent memories can be so
Mm-hmm.
strong and visceral. And there's just something, if you crush up the leaves of a sword fern, it tastes, I mean, it smells, I say taste because
Mm-hmm.
it's like so visceral. It has this sort of guava smell. It's really bright and
Oh.
fresh and sweet. And anytime I smell that smell now, I just like it takes me back to that space of feeling so connected and held by the forest. And it's just such a strong emotion. So that sensory experience with fern, at this point, that's what I think. That's like why I chose sword fern today,
Wow.
because it goes beyond just knowing facts about the plant and
Uh-huh.
actually having that personal connection, and feeling like cared for by a plant.
Yeah, that's wow, what a cool story. Thanks for sharing that. I really like this
Yeah.
like stages and how it's almost like Swordfern was like bringing you in little by little until it was like enveloping you, which is that's a really nice
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, totally.
Um, okay, I have a few questions.
Yes.
First of all, why is it called Swordfern? Do you know?
I think it's because it just looks like a sword blade.
Okay.
It's kind of, yeah, the way it's shaped is it's like I said, it has this long stem in the middle and then all of these sort of thin, and the leaves kind of look like swords too. So kind of these thin
Mm.
leaves that coming off to the side, and it's sort of a simple structure. Other
Oh
ferns
yeah.
sort of fan out a little bit more, but this one, it's super long, super straight. They can grow pretty tall, and it's just really, it kind of looks like a sword. So I imagine that's why.
Yeah. I can see I can totally see both the overall shape and the individual little side leaves both have this kind of
Yeah.
like yeah, that's cool.
And the
Um,
stems grow around in a crown. They don't come off of each other. It doesn't branch out.
mm,
Each stem comes straight up from the
from the
middle.
same spot in the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing that I'm thinking about is uh, I know that there's some ferns where the fiddlehead is edible. Is this one of those? Is this something you didn't mention? It's
No, that's the funny thing about sword fern is like you look it up and it's basically like, yeah, this isn't really good for food or medicine. It's just sort of there. The
uh
fiddleheads are actually very hairy. And I think a lot of
mm,
fiddleheads are. These aren't the best for food or
mm-hmm,
nutrition. I haven't tried eating them. I think they probably don't taste great.
mm-hmm.
And they're super cute, though. They look like a little elephant trunk, like hairy
uh,
cephalopagus trunks as they're unfolding. But no, you can't really eat them. I think that you can eat the rhizomes in the
mm-hmm,
spring. And the indigenous tribes here used to use it as like what was called like starvation food in the spring.
uh-huh,
So I'm guessing
uh-huh.
like if you have no other choice, you could, roast or steam the rhizomes and peel them and eat them. But it's not something people go looking for. Like if
Sure.
you're foraging, you're going to be looking for better stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. Yeah, I've talked about this a few times on the show, and actually, my plant has a little bit of this thing. But I when I got into plants, I was really into edible plants, and that's what I was like really focused on. And I've been growing and learning more that not every plant is for me, and not every plant's value is just to eat, right? And I think this your story with swordfern is a really great example of excellent, personal value beyond the
Hmm.
ecosystem value that is also beyond just a food, which is pretty cool.
Right. Yeah. It's also, I should say, it does have some, I mean, I think it was used for a while as sort of to put on the floor,
Mm,
um, to sort of cover floors or use to make mats and that kind of thing because it can get really stiff and they're really hardy. And sort
mm,
of the way we use them as a mattress, they've been used that way for thousands of years as well. So
cool.
they have
That's
sort of
cool.
that physical functional use. I think people would line pit ovens with the ferns.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
Yeah, but
Yeah, they
other
look.
than that,
They're like. I'm looking at the picture that like the leaves look like they're like a bit tougher than I think of like some of the ferns that I see around here. Anyway,
yeah,
they're like sturdy.
yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, this is a scientific question. Maybe I don't know if you know the answer to this. It's okay if you don't. I'm never afraid to tell the audience to Google it. But I know that ferns are kind of this special kind of plant, and that they have spores and not seeds. And I
Hmm.
wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. If you don't have the details, it's fine. But I just know that they're kind of special as far as like what we think of plants.
Yeah, I actually don't know as much about like the propagation factor. So I
Yeah.
do know they do have spores. I think I've seen people talk about sprinkling the spores in order to
hmm
like grow more ferns. That's the extent of my knowledge of that part of it.
I'll either at the beginning of this episode, audience, you already have heard this if I did this at the beginning, or at the end of the show, we'll guess. I'll fill in something there. I do remember one thing. I forget which episode I talked about this, and I think it was about moss, and somehow we started talking about ferns too. Um, there was, I think, a long time where like, you know, Europeans thought that ferns were just magical because there was no fruit or seeds, and like the idea was like you pick a plant, you get its fruit, you take the seed, you put it in the ground, you grow a plant. But then there's this plant
Mm.
that didn't have that, and they're like, no one understood how it worked, and they're like, "Whoa, this is some kind of just plant that pops up out of like nothing." But then we figured out the spore thing.
Yeah, I like thinking of it as a magical plant, though.
Yeah, yeah, I think it still is. The other question that I was thinking about is I had a friend who lived out in the Pacific Northwest, and I was chatting with her about that, and I think aren't there a fair number, or maybe just one species of invasive ferns that are pretty like pervasive in that area? Or is that something you're aware of?
Invasive ferns. I'm actually not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, uh, it could potentially be are bracken ferns invasive? I
Oh,
don't actually
maybe
know
that's
about
the
that.
one. I'm gonna
I
Google it
know
really
they
quick.
bracken ferns sort of take over, and I know a lot of people who like always want to clear them out at a certain point before they die off. I think also because they just cause a lot of debris around and they're not pretty once they die off. But I'm not sure if they're invasive. I do know people who don't like them.
Yeah, I think that might be the one I'm thinking of, but don't quote me on that, audience. Maybe we'll get to someone
Okay.
who's into bracken ferns. But anyway, I'm always wondering about. I think we have a lot of fern here. I live on the East Coast, and it's not one that I have a huge connection with, but it's called hay scented fern. But I'm fairly sure
Mm.
it's not native. Don't. I'm speculating about a lot about ferns here, audience. So apologies. I don't know a lot about ferns. I gotta go build some relationship with some ferns now.
Yeah, you should. They're
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, did we miss anything about sword fern? Anything in your notes there that fun facts or dazzling details?
Well, here's a fun fact, and I didn't get a chance to sort of really fact check this, but this is something I came across in a couple of books. And so, but apparently, uh, in some indigenous Coast Salish languages, it's known as the pala pala plant or pala
Hmm.
pala because there was a game children would play that involved seeing how many leaves you could pluck off in a single breath while saying pala. So like you would take a big breath, and each time you pluck a leaf, you say pala and see like how many leaves you can pluck
Oh,
off, which
like
is
off a
interesting.
single
It
branch.
sounds
I see.
fun.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah, it
off a
does. Yeah,
single, and there's a lot of leaves, so I can see that being a fun challenge. I thought that was kind of fun, but
yeah. I like that. I have to. I'm gonna incorporate some game like that. That's a fun. It's a fun game. Also, a good way to build lung capacity, I guess.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Cool. Well, yeah. Did we miss anything else about? I don't want to give the sword fern in short shrift.
I think that's about it. That's
Oh,
everything I wanted to share about it. I'm sure there are
wonderful.
lots of amazing things about sword fern that I haven't shared, but
Well, I think it was such a cool story, and I think the kind of thing that like I think about a lot with this podcast of why are plants meaningful to people, and I think a lot of people don't stop to think about it, but when you do, things really start to pop out, and I think that your experience is a great example of that.
yeah. Yeah. And I think, and this is part of what I do is encourage people to do this, but I'd really encourage people, if you're interested in a plant, if it's like cool, it has cool facts, or you can do cool stuff with it and it's interesting in that way, I would encourage people to go out and find the plant and just sit with it and just sort of make friends in a different way. Because sometimes I just think the reason plants do things for us as humans, the reason they're medicinal for us, or the reason we can eat them, is because we've had a close relationship with them for a very long time. And we shouldn't forget about that personal, sort of heart level connection that people have with plants. And we can really learn from them in that way.
20th Century Fox invites you to witness the wonder, the music, and the adventure of a place worlds away from anything you've ever seen. Fern Gully.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing about sword fern with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Yes, that'd be awesome.
Awesome. So this one, I think this is one that is not very common, if at all, over on the West Coast, and it's one that I didn't learn about till actually, my wife and I bought this house, and if you listen to the show, having this house with a yard and is really kind of a very beginning of a lot of the like diving into plants. There's some earlier stories too, but this one was one of the first. I'm going to say plants I identified in my yard, even though at the time I would have said weed I identified in my yard, but actually weed is a weird word in general, but this one in particular, I really don't think should be considered a weed. So to get to the plant, I was sticking with the metallurgical theme here, so you picked the sword fern, and this is called Virginia Copperleaf. So we've got some swords and copper. And it also has another really cool name, which is also known as Virginia three-seeded mercury, which is a pretty cool name. And its scientific name is Acalypha virginica. And, it's a pretty unassuming plant, particularly when I see it. It can get, I guess, up to 2 feet tall, but most of the time in my yard, it doesn't get that tall at all. It's small. It's got these leaves that come off mostly opposite of each other. They're kind of actually a little bit similar to the shape of nettle leaves. And in fact, the genus name Acalypha is a reference to the Greek word for nettle, because Linnaeus was like, the leaves are similar, so he called it, even though they're not related to nettle, they look similar. This is a plant, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, that is not edible. In fact, it's a member of the spurge family, and I think this is an episode of firsts because you had the first fern, and I believe this is the first spurge we're talking about, which is a pretty cool
That's
family
a good word.
of plants. It is a really great work, and I've heard the word spurge before, and I was like, what's the deal with the word spurge? It kind of sounds like purge, and that's where the name comes from. The Old English word espurge means to purge, and it's because many of the plants in the spurge family have a purgative property, and particularly the one I forget the specific one that was used that way, but most of them are not edible. Well, there's a few exceptions, but a lot of them aren't edible. A lot of them have some kind of toxic property. In fact, castor, which is a really poisonous plant, it has the poison ricin, is a spurge. And then most of them also have a milky sap. So rubber is actually a spurge as well. The rubber tree is a spurge. So it's a very wide genus with different shapes and sizes. But the Virginia copperleaf, I think, you would probably get sick if you ate it, but it's kind of special in that it doesn't have the milky sap. Which is kind of a standout. So there's a couple other things in the same genus that I guess even do have that quality, but this one doesn't. It's called copperleaf because even though it's like a little tiny plant that's it's a little herbaceous plant that grows kind of in the yard, weed-like, quote unquote, it does turn like a rusty color in the fall. So that's why it's called the Virginia copperleaf. The three-seeded mercury thing. It does have these little seed pods, which have these 3 segments, and each segment has a little seed in it. And then they call it mercury because and I haven't seen this, or I need to look at this closer this year. I need to sit with this plant through some seasons and look at it closer. But the way the little flowers come out from the center stalk, it's very it looks very messy and complicated. But I guess if you're able to look at one of the flowers, they look a little bit like the wings on Mercury's boots. So the god Mercury. So it's not related to the
Yeah.
metal Mercury. It's related to the Greek god
Okay.
Mercury. And there are some genuses of the same. There's some plants of the same genus from Europe. So where the name came from.
Hmm.
The the thing that I think is really interesting to me, and it kind of relates back to what we were talking about before, um, about not every plant is for us. Sometimes plants are for other creatures. One thing that I noticed and I actually read about online, someone else pointed out that whenever I've seen this in my yard, all the leaves are full of tiny little holes. And some people might look at that and be like, "That looks weird and it looks like not healthy." But looking at it the other way, I'm like, "This is food for bugs." Right? This plant is here for these bugs and they're eating it. And that's super important. We talked about back in this episode about multiflora rose. When we have invasive plants in wild or even non-wild environments, it's like deserts to bugs, right? Like there's these plants they've never seen before. They don't eat them, and then when there's no bugs, there's no birds, and the whole like basis of the food chain is based in what the bugs can eat. And if we have so many invasive plants, it's a problem. So the fact that this plant, which is native to this area, it grows like a lot of weeds though, and so people hate it because it pops up everywhere. It goes in disturbed areas, but it is a native plant, and it's actually really nice to see a native plant that has that kind of ability. Often the native plants kind of get overrun by weeds, but this one can do it,
Hmm.
and is food for bugs, and the birds love the seeds apparently. I think it's an awesome plant, and like so much of the internet is filled with like how to get rid of it, and I'm like, wow, this is what it's for. It's here to feed the bugs and the birds.
Wow, yeah. I love that you're bringing up that not all food or not all plants are just for us. Like that's something I don't hear a lot of people talking about. And we're just so self-centered a lot of the
Uh huh.
time, especially with like this native plant. I love that it's hardy enough to keep surviving, if even
Hmm.
though seems like people don't really want it around. But yeah, it sounds really beautiful. Now I want to find out more about it, and it's interesting to me that there are so many plants like that that we don't like because it's like on our lawn,
Hmm.
which isn't really supposed to be here, the
Hmm.
lawn.
Hmm.
And suddenly I'm really curious about all the other plants that are out there that might actually have like really, really important ecological impacts on the even just the bugs that maybe I'm still trying to get rid of.
Yeah, I I've gone through a lot, almost all of the different species now. Well, probably not. It's probably a lot of surprising ones, but of the stuff that's in my lawn, I have a little bit only. I have very little lawn left. I've put a lot of planter beds in, but there's a lot of and what is left is kind of like a barely controlled meadow. But a lot of
Yeah,
those species, because there was original lawn, a lot of those species are not native, right? Even the
yeah.
classics, like we talked about, Kentucky bluegrass is a European grass. It's got that Kentucky name much later. So it's really cool when there is a plant in my lawn that, like, hey, this is weedy. People don't like it, but this is a native plant. This is what should be here, not all this other stuff. Same thing. I talked about this one called straw colored. Oh, I forget the name. Straw colored. I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, it's another weird little grass that most people would just mow down. And one day I looked at it and I was like, "What is that?" And I looked it up. I was like, "Oh, this is a native grass in my yard." So
Oh man.
thinking about those ones and trying to let them be. So I think in the past I've mowed copperleaf. I actually feel kind of bad now, and so maybe
Hmm.
that's why I've never seen it get 2 feet tall, which it can. So this year I'm gonna avoid mowing the copperleaf and let it kind
You're
of
just gonna leave
do
it.
its thing. Yeah. Let it feed the
Yeah.
bugs, let it grow, let it
Yeah.
feed the birds in the fall, and let it be the plant, for all the other creatures in the neighborhood, not me.
Yeah, I love that. How I'm curious right now, like what does your lawn look like right now? What stage is the copper leaf at? And are there lots of them out there?
Well, copperleaf right now is not up yet, so that's an interesting thing about it. It's a late spring germinator,
Mm.
and it really doesn't get noticeable till the summer. So when I first noticed it, when I bought the house, we bought the house in it was July, and there was a lot of it, pretty small. But I'm not going to start seeing it, I think, until sometime in July. And so, yeah, I should start to pay attention of how it germinates. But it is an interesting one that it really needs direct sun. It won't germinate in partial shade. That's why it likes the edges of forests, but also the disturbed areas like lawns or like along roads and things like that. And as it grows, it starts off as kind of just when I first saw it, it looks kind of like it could be an herb. It looks like it's in the same kind of family as like a basil or something, which it's not. Don't eat it, audience. But it has that same kind of like quality. But then I guess when it starts to get taller, it starts forking from the bottom. So it can look like multiple plants coming from the same bottom, but it doesn't do that till pretty late. And I don't think I've ever seen it in that state because I think I've always probably ended up mowing it, which I feel bad about now. So I'm going to really try to take care of my copperleaf this year when it pops up in the summer.
Awesome. Do you know okay, so now I'm thinking it's growing in your lawn.
Yeah.
And do you know what happens if you do eat it, like specifically copperleaf, or like if a pet eats it, or like
I think it gives you an upset stomach and probably some like, GI issues. I haven't read that it's like deadly poison like some of the other spurges, but it's not something that you have a good time. I couldn't find any references anywhere to any kind of ingestion use, even medicinal for this one. And that's, it's a weird thing of like some plants we just like end up ignoring, and maybe we ignore them because no one has found something useful about them, or maybe, I don't know. It's one of the plants that it's actually not a ton of information about it out there. It's not as easy to find people talking about it. And I should spend a little more time, going into some deeper references because you can find some surprising stuff. But yeah, I don't think it really has any. I think it wouldn't be fun if you ate it. I think I read some other ones in the same genus, are a bit even less fun. But yeah. And there is one called actually. So that one last little bit here. This is Acalypha virginica. There's another one that's called Acalypha rhomboidea, and it's possible what I have in my yard is rhomboidea. They're very, very similar, I think. But when I first learned what it is, I was called copperleaf, and the rhomboidea is not referred to as copperleaf. So, they're really similar. I was reading like the subtle differences if you want to look at. So I'm going to try to be for sure that is. But they're both native to North America. They're very, very similar plants. In fact, I think they used to refer to them as just different, cultivars of each other, or not cultivars, but subspecies. Yeah. But I guess someone has decided they are actually distinct species of each other. So I'm going to keep an eye on it and see if I can learn a little bit more about that, and just try to give this plant a little more of its due and recognize it for kind of its role in the environment here.
Yeah, I like that. I always like giving a little bit of attention to like the plants that don't seem to get enough, or seem to get a bad rap a little bit.
I know I got a bad reputation, and it isn't just talk. If I could only give you everything, I haven't got.
Let's talk about ferns. As you could hear in the episode, I knew very little about ferns until I was speaking with our guest Tina, and since then I've done even more research, and wow, ferns are fascinating. I had no idea. One thing I've said a lot on the show is that sometimes it's hard for us to identify with plants because their way of being is so different from our own, and that is doubly true of the fern because it is so weird the way that they work. I don't want to say weird. It's how ferns do it, but it is definitely not what we're used to. So let's talk about ferns, and specifically fern reproduction. It is so fascinating. So the first thing is that ferns can take on two different forms. Ferns exhibit this thing called alternation of generations, and every other generation of fern is one of these two forms. So there's the fern that we all know. There's another form called the prothallus. Let me explain how it works a little bit. So the fern that we're all used to seeing, the fern plants, those ones have these special organs called sporangia that produce spores. And at some point, normally in the summer, they release their spores into the wild. Those spores float around and then they land somewhere, and if it's the right conditions, they will germinate. But they will not germinate into a new fern. They will germinate into a different form of the fern plant, which is called the prothallus. And this is a very tiny thing. It looks like a little green heart. And this form of plant has both male and female reproductive organs. And under the right conditions, the sperm of one prothallus will fertilize the egg of another, and then that egg will then turn into a new fern plant, and the cycle continues. So isn't that just wild? Like, imagine if we worked that way, if we had like two different, completely unrecognizable forms of human every other generation. Wild. The other thing that I learned that is just really blew my mind, I did not know this at all, and is really interesting to think about this fact, that the sperm of fern plants are what are known as motile. So that means that they swim. And they don't look exactly like what you imagine in your mind if you're thinking of sperm, but they have many little flagella that wiggle, maybe over a dozen, and they swim. And in order for a prothallus to fertilize another one, it needs to be a wet condition so that the sperm from this little heart-shaped thing can swim through the water to fertilize the egg of another little fern prothallus. And so it just blew my mind that like a plant, something that is stationary, it has part of its life cycle involves this like actual movement. And ferns aren't the only plants that have that. It is fairly rare, and there's a number of other ones you can look it up. But I was like, wait, what? When I was reading about this, that it actually moves, and the sperm of ferns swim through water to fertilize the eggs. Really blew my mind, and that leads me to a really good $50 word that if you want to bring out at a party, and that word is zoidogamy, and that is a description of a plant that has this motile sperm so that it can move through water to fertilize the egg of another plant. And that word zoidogamy, it comes from the root zoe or zoo, which is having to do with animals, and then gamy has to do with gametes, which is the description for the reproductive cells of plants and animals. And so zoidogamy means animal-like. So I thought that was really, really amazing. And there's actually even more amazing things about ferns. They're really amazing and unique plants, and I was just blown away learning all these facts. So thank you for letting me share with you this kind of like basic reproduction of the fern, and we'll talk to you on another episode of Rootbound. Thank you for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Tina Goldhammer Frey. Tina is a certified nature and forest therapy guide, and you can learn more about Tina's work at her website, which is greetthewild.com, and Greet the Wild is also her handle on all of the social media sites. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the different ways that you can support the program, including supporting on Patreon. Rootbound is hosted by the Fern Fascinated Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Alani. You know, Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, find your favorite spot in the woods and just sit for a while.
The family Solanaceae. We've got food and poison.